The ledger was the first thing she carried out to the field that morning, before the feed, before the water, before the sun had cleared the elevator 3 miles east. It was a thin book, bound in cracked black leather, the spine gone soft as a glove, and on the first page, in faded brown ink, a woman who had been dead 19 years had written a single line. Hens to the wheat by the second week of June. Move them with the heat. Let nothing crawl that the birds can reach. Hattie Voss held the book open against the wind with one broad thumb and read the line the way some women read scripture, not for the words, which she knew, but for the hand that had made them. She was 58 years old that summer of 1937, and she farmed a full section of hard red winter wheat in Sherman County, in the flat far western corner of Kansas, where the land runs out toward Colorado, and the sky takes up 9/10 of everything. Her husband Carl had been dead 4 years. Her mother, who wrote the line in the ledger, had been dead 19. Between the two of them, they had left her this section road, this gray clapboard house with the porch that sagged on the north side, this sagging barn, and a method that every man in the county had decided was a joke. Hattie closed the ledger and set it on the seat of the wagon, and then she opened the long, low coop and let the chickens out into the morning. 1,000 of them came, not all at once, but in a yellow and rust flood that spread along the headland and into the green gold wheat. 1,000 hens of no particular breeding, buff Orpingtons and barred Plymouth Rocks, and a great many plain brown mongrel birds her mother had built up over 40 years for one quality and one only, which was appetite. They went into the wheat with their heads down and their feet working, and within a minute the field was alive with the small, dry sound of 1,000 beaks taking insects off the stems and out of the dirt. A grasshopper came up off a wheat head, and a hen took it in the air. That was the method. That was the whole of it. That was the thing the men at the Goodland Cafe had laughed about for 4 years. She walked the east headland with a willow switch, moving the birds the way her mother had taught her, not driving them, but drifting them, keeping the flock spread so no acre got picked bare and no acre got missed. The heat was already coming up off the ground at 7 in the morning. It had not rained a proper rain since early May. The wheat was thinner than she wanted and shorter than her mother's wheat had ever been, but it was clean. There was not a cutworm in it, not a wireworm under it, not a chinch bug in the low places where the chinch bugs always came. The hens had eaten them. The hens ate everything. Out past her west fence on Dale Renner's section, a tractor was already moving, and behind it a homemade boom was laying a wet, dark stripe across the dirt. Renner was poisoning. Half the county was poisoning that June, mixing bran and molasses and sawdust and sodium arsenite in the bed of a wagon and broadcasting it on the field edges for the grasshoppers to eat. The county agent had brought the formula down from the state college, and there were men driving the poison wagons from Goodland to the Colorado line. It was the modern thing. It was the scientific thing. It was, those same men agreed, a far sight more sensible than turning 1,000 chickens loose in good wheat, like some old woman who had never gotten over her mother. Hattie heard the tractor and did not look up. She moved her birds. Her mother's name had been Eliza Voss, and she had come out to this country in 1879 from a hard, hungry place in the old country where the people had no land of their own and no money for the things that came in jars and sacks, and so they had used what walked and what grew. Eliza had told her daughter more than once, sitting on the north porch in the cool of an evening with the ledger open on her knee, that there was no insect on God's earth a hen would not eat if you put her to it in time, and that the whole secret was the same one that applied to every hard thing on a farm. You moved before the trouble arrived, not after. You made the field a place where nothing could breed because nothing could live to lay. The bird that scratched a grasshopper out of the soil in April meant 1,000 grasshoppers that never hatched in July. The ledger was full of it, page after page in the brown ink, dates and counts and weather, 40 years of a woman teaching herself 1 acre at a time what the chickens could do. Hattie had grown up inside that knowledge the way other children grow up inside a church. She had never once doubted it. It had never once failed her, and it had made her, in the eyes of every man between Goodland and the state line, a figure of gentle pity, the widow Voss with her chicken farm, who could have leased her section to a serious man and gone to live decent in town. The serious man came that same afternoon in a clean Stetson, driving a Ford pickup he kept washed. His name was Garland Shaw, and he owned the half section directly north of her and had owned, in his own estimation, the right to the rest of her ever since Carl went into the ground. He parked in front of the porch and climbed out without taking off the clean hat, and he stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked out over her 1,000 hens working the wheat as though he were pricing a thing he already half believed was his. "Hattie," he said, "I'll come to it plain. You've let grief get the better of your judgment 4 years running now, and folks have been kind about it, but a chicken yard is no way to hold good wheat ground." He nodded at the field. "I'll lease the whole section off you fair money, and you keep the house and a garden and your peace of mind. Your mother, God rest her, would not want to see you out here wearing yourself to nothing for a flock of laying hens." Hattie reached into the wagon bed and took out the ledger and held it up so he could see the cracked black spine of it, though she did not open it. "My mother," she said, "wrote down what these laying hens did to a chinch bug year in 1896 and again in 1911 when your daddy's wheat went down and ours stood. You can read it if you can read her hand. Until then, Garland, keep your fair money. The section's not for lease, and it's not for sale, and grief never had a thing to do with it." Shaw's jaw worked. He cast his eyes over the book, over the hens, over the old woman holding both, and he got back in the washed Ford and drove out, and the dust of him hung over the section road a long time in the still hot air. She put the ledger back on the wagon seat and went on moving her birds. That evening, after the flock was in and the lamp was lit, she opened the ledger to a page she had not looked at in years. Near the back, where her mother had pasted in a thing Hattie had forgotten. It was a brittle square of newspaper, the print gone the color of weak tea, cut from the Goodland Weekly in the summer of 1911. It reported a chinch bug infestation across the western counties that had taken better than half the wheat from Goodland to the line. Below it, in the brown ink, her mother had written 4 words. Ours stood. Birds out. Nothing more than that. Eliza Voss had not been a woman who wasted ink. But she had saved the clipping for 26 years so that her daughter would have proof in another man's printing that the method had already beaten one plague. This same ground threw up. Hattie read the 4 words twice and closed the book and sat a while with her hand flat on the cover, and then she blew out the lamp. The egg money kept the place running while the wheat grew, and that too was the method, because 1,000 laying hens are not only an army against the bugs, but a wage that comes in every single morning, whether it rains or not. She candled eggs by lamplight 3 nights a week, and crated them for the produce man out of Goodland, and in a dry year when wheat was a gamble and cattle were dying for want of grass, the egg crates were the one sure thing on the place. Eliza had put that down in the ledger, too, in her way. A field can fail you in a season. A hen fails you in a day, and there's 900 more. She counted the flock at the well that noon, the way she counted them twice a day, and came up 986. She had turned out 1,004 in the spring. Hawks and one bad night with a fox accounted for the difference. And she wrote the number in the ledger under the date, 986, in her own hand below her mother's, the 2 scripts running down the page together. It was mid-June, 10 days short of the solstice. The wheat would come ripe by the first week of July, 3 weeks off. And somewhere south and west of her, down in the short grass country toward the Cimarron, the grasshoppers were already hatching out of ground baked hard as a kiln, more of them than anyone in Sherman County had seen in a lifetime, and they were beginning the way they did, to walk. The men at the cafe found out she was being studied before she did. It was the last Saturday of June, hot, the wind out of the southwest carrying grit, and 4 of them were leaning on the rail outside Hollinsworth's store in Goodland when the agricultural man's car went past raising dust on the road that led out to her place. Marvin Tubb, who farmed north of her and had buried 2 crops to the wind that decade, watched the car go and spat and said that now they were sending college men out to look at the chicken woman, and wasn't that the world for you? Earl Dietz laughed. Lloyd Penner, who was Dale Renner's cousin and never let you forget the spelling, said that what they ought to study was how a grown woman could let good ground go to barnyard. They laughed at that, the 4 of them on the rail, the laughter wearing the clothing of concern, the way it always did. Oh, it's a shame. Oh, somebody ought to talk to her. Oh, her poor mother would weep. She had to go into Goodland herself that Saturday for binder twine and a sack of cracked corn, and she heard the rail before she reached it. The 4 of them were still there when she came up the board sidewalk with her list in her hand, and they did not lower their voices for her. That was the cruelty of it. They never lowered their voices. "Here's the chicken general now," Marvin Tubb said loud to the others watching her come. "How's the war on the grasshoppers, missus? You winning?" "Heard she's got a college man counting her bugs," said Earl Dietz. "Reckon he counts 'em while they're laying eggs in your wheat." "Leave a hen to do a man's work," Lloyd Penner said, "and you'll have eggs where you wanted bread." Hattie stopped on the sidewalk in front of them with her list in her hand. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile. "Marvin," she said, "you buried wheat to the wind in 34 and 35, and you'll bury it again, and I'm sorry for it because you work hard. But you've spread poison on your field edges every June for 4 years, and the hoppers are worse this year than last, not better. You ever ask yourself why a thing you do every year only ever gets worse? My hens don't poison the next year's hatch. They eat it. That's the difference between us. That's the whole of the joke." The 4 men on the rail had no answer for that, which is the only kind of answer that matters to such men, and she went on into Hollinsworth's and bought her twine and her corn and drove home. And the men watched her go and said, when she was out of earshot, that it was a shame, A real shame what grief did to a woman's mind. The college man they had been laughing about had a name. It was Dr. Albert Reinhold, an entomologist from the State Agricultural College, and he was at that very moment standing at the edge of Hattie Voss's east field with a cloth-bound notebook, watching 1,000 hens move through wheat, and he was not laughing at all. He had introduced himself at the gate. He had a careful, dry way of speaking, and he kept his hat in his hands. He said he had been sent to survey grasshopper conditions in the western counties, and that her field had been reported to him as an anomaly. He used that word, anomaly, and then the color rose slightly in his collar, and he said what he meant was that her wheat was clean, and nobody could tell him why. "The hens," Hattie said. He wrote that down. Then he asked if he might walk the field, and she let him. And the two of them went out along the headland with the birds parting and closing around their boots. And Reinhold stopped every few yards and went down on his haunches and turned over clods and parted the wheat at its base and looked. And the longer he looked, the more careful his face became. He took a small tin and a trowel, and he counted insects in a measured square of her ground and wrote the number. And then he walked back across her fence onto the strip of Dale Renner's land that bordered hers and counted insects in a measured square there on the poisoned ground and wrote that number. And when he stood up, he stood looking at the two numbers for a long moment. "On his ground," Reinhold said slowly, "in 1 square yard I count better than 30 young hoppers in the soil. On yours, in the same square, I count 2, and both of those were dead." "The hens got the rest," Hattie said. "They get them small when they can't fly. That's the whole of it. Send the flock into the field before the hoppers take wing, and they eat the next year's plague out of the ground." Reinhold studied his notebook, and then he raised his eyes to her, and then he asked, in the voice of a man asking a thing he half believed and was afraid to want, whether she would let him come back through the season and keep a record. He said the college would be very interested. He said it carefully, the way you carry something you do not want to spill. She said he could come back. She said it without any pleasure in it, the way she said most things. And as he was leaving, he stopped at the gate and asked one more thing, whether, if it came to writing it up, she would mind her name being used. "Don't use my name," he said, surprising her, getting it backward in his nervousness, and then catching himself. "I mean, they'll say I went soft on an old woman's superstition. If I write it, you'll be Cooperator B. Until I'm sure." "Be sure, then," Hattie said, and shut the gate. She did not tell anyone about the entomologist. But Sherman County was a small place strung along one road, and by the middle of July, everyone knew that the chicken woman had a college man coming out. And the knowing did not make them kinder. It made them watchful, the way men get watchful of a thing they have committed themselves against. They had spent 4 years deciding she was a fool. A college man counting bugs in her wheat was an inconvenience to that, and so they laughed louder. She moved her birds. She counted them. 971 now, then 963 after a hot week took the oldest hens. She entered each count on the page below her mother's hand. The wheat headed out and went from green to gold, and the heads were not heavy, but they were sound. Every one of them filled, none of them eaten hollow. She walked the field at dawn and at dusk, and in the worst heat she sat on the north porch with the ledger and read her mother's 40 years and waited, because she had grown up inside this and she knew what June grasshoppers meant for August, and she knew that the thing her mother had built this method against was not a bad bug year. It was the year the bugs ate the world, and she could feel it coming the way you feel weather in a bad tooth. Then, in the last days of June, with the wheat near ripe and the flock holding the field, the thing happened that nearly took it all from her, and it did not come from the grasshoppers at all. It came from the poison. There was a south wind for 3 days running, hard and dry, and on the second day of it, Garland Shaw's hired man broadcast a fresh wagon load of arsenic bran along the whole length of Shaw's south fence, which ran the north edge of Hattie's place, and he did it in a wind that carried the dust of it down into her field. She found the first dead hens at noon, 11 of them, then more, scattered along the north headland, where they had scratched in the drift and eaten the poisoned bran off her own ground. By evening, she had gathered up 31 dead birds in the wagon bed, and her count at the well was down to 932, and her hands were shaking when she set that count down under her mother's, because she had never in her life lost birds to a thing she could not name and could not fight. She walked the north fence in the last light and found the bran in the dirt, gray-green pellets of it caught in the wheat stubble where the wind had laid them, the same poison the whole county swore by, killing the one thing in Sherman County that was actually holding a field. She stood there a long while. For the first time in 4 years, she let herself wonder out loud to the empty field whether her mother had ever faced a year that beat the method, and whether this was that year. The answer came up the section road the next morning, in the person of the neighbor's wife. Her name was Verna Shaw, Garland's wife, a stout plain woman in a faded house dress and an apron with flour still on her hands, and she came on foot because she did not want her husband to see the truck gone. She stood in Hattie's yard and looked at the wagon bed of dead hens, and her face went hard. "Garland did this," Verna said. It was not a question. "He poisoned your birds to break you, Hattie, the same as he's tried to lease you out for 4 years, and I'll not stand in my own kitchen and pretend I don't know it." She drew a breath. "I buried his own mother. I laid out your Carl. I sat up with your Eliza the night she passed in that house yonder, and she told me, Hattie, that the hens would hold against anything but a man's spite. And now I've seen the spite. Move your bird south, away from his fence today, and I'll see he broadcasts no more of it. He'll listen to me, or he'll cook his own supper the rest of his days." So Hattie moved her flock south, off the poisoned ground, and Verna Shaw walked home. What happened in that kitchen was not witnessed by Hattie, but it was witnessed by the whole north end of the Shaw property, because Garland Shaw was a man who kept his windows open in summer, and his hired man later told people he had never heard Verna Shaw raise her voice in 20 years, and he had never seen Garland Shaw sit down at a kitchen table without being invited to do so, and say nothing. Verna came through the back door with her flour-dusted apron still on, and she stood at the far end of the table, and she named what he had done out loud: the poisoned bran, the south wind, the dead birds, the section of ground he had tried to break from under a widow. And she named it without raising her voice, which was worse. She said, when she was done, that she had one ask, and he would do it. He would call his hired man off that fence line for the rest of the season, and if he could not do that one thing, she would go to her sister's in Dodge City, and he would cook his own harvest suppers from July to October. Garland Shaw looked at the table, and then he looked at the window, and then he said, yes. No more bran came over the north fence. But the tally held at 932, and Hattie did not gain a bird back, because you do not raise a hen to fighting weight in a week, and the grasshoppers were 3 days out. It came the first week of July, 3 days before her wheat was ready to cut. A man named Hollis Crane, who farmed the far southwest corner of the county down against the Colorado line, drove up her section road in the early morning with his hat off and his face the color of ash, and stopped his truck in her yard, and Hattie came out onto the porch with the ledger still in her hand. Crane was not a man who came to her place. He had laughed at the rail with the rest. But he stood in her yard now with his hat in his two hands, and he said, "Mrs. Voss, they're coming. They come over my place at first light, and there's nothing left. They're moving north. They're in Renner's by now, I judge." "How thick," Hattie said. "I've farmed here 30 years, Crane said, and his voice broke on it. "I never saw the ground move before. The fence posts are gray with them. They ate the paint off my wagon. They ate the handle of my hoe where the sweat was." That was the differential grasshopper, and the migratory grasshopper with it, in the numbers that only came in a drought year off baked ground, a hatch the poison wagons had been driving against since June, and had not stopped, because you cannot poison a thing in the numbers of an ocean. They came up out of the short grass country in a front you could see, a low brown shimmer along the ground that moved at the pace of a walking man, and where it passed, it left the dirt. Not the stubble, the dirt. They took the wheat to the ground, and then they took the garden, and then they took the leaves off the cottonwoods and the bark off the young limbs, and behind the front the fields that men had sprayed all June stood as bare and clean swept as a swept floor, because the poison killed the hoppers it touched, and the next 10,000 walked over their bodies and kept coming. Hattie set the ledger inside the door and went out to her birds. She did not panic, and she did not pray. She did the thing her mother's ledger had been written for. She opened the coop, and she opened the garden gate, and she drove the whole of her flock, 932 of them, the count unchanged since the poison, she had told them off at dawn, out to the south and west fence line, the line the grasshoppers would reach first, and she spread them along it in a living wall 4 and 5 birds deep, and she walked that fence with her willow switch keeping them on it, and she let them eat. The front reached her fence at mid-morning. She heard it before she saw it, a dry, seething hiss like rain that was not rain, and then the wheat on the Renner side began to shake and bow with no wind, and then they came over the wire, and her hens met them. It was not quiet. 1,000 chickens feeding at the top of their hunger on grasshoppers coming in a flood make a sound a person does not forget, a wet, relentless racket of beaks. And the hens did not tire, and they did not slow. They walked the front the way she walked them, a living edge eating an advancing edge, and where a normal year's hoppers would have overwhelmed any number of birds. This was not a normal feeding. This was a wall of food, walking into a wall of appetite 1,000 strong, bred up over 60 years for exactly this hunger. The hoppers that got past the south fence met the second rank in the wheat. The ones that got past the wheat birds met the garden birds at the garden fence. By the time the front had walked the depth of her field, hour upon hour of it through the worst heat of the day, the flood was a trickle, and the trickle was gulls of dust where the hens had scratched and her wheat was standing. Out past her fences on every side, the county was a desert by 2 in the afternoon. She walked her field at the end of it, with the sun going down red through the dust the hoppers had raised, and her boots crushed dead grasshoppers, 6 deep along the south fence where the birds had held, and her wheat stood gold and whole and filled to the awn in a country swept down to the bare dirt for 30 miles in every direction. She counted her birds at the well as the dusk came down, the way she always did. 909. She had lost 23 hens to the heat and the work of that single day. She opened the ledger and entered it under her mother's hand, 909, and beside it, in the brown going black of her own ink, she wrote one word her mother had never needed to write. Held. The first to come was the neighbor's son. It was the next morning, barely light, and Hattie was out at the south fence shoveling dead hoppers into the wagon to spread on the garden, and a young man came walking up the section road on foot, because the cars could not get traction on the carpet of dead insects that lay over every road in the county. He was Dale Renner's boy, Tom, maybe 28, in work clothes gray with dust, and he stopped at her gate and took his hat off and held it against his chest, and he did not know how to begin. "My father didn't send me," he said. "I didn't think he did," said Hattie. The boy looked out across her standing wheat, the only standing wheat from the gate to the curve of the earth, and then his eyes went to the 1,000 hens scratching the bare south field for what the night had left, and something moved in his face that was very close to grief. "We sprayed since June," Tom Renner said. "We did everything the agent said. We did it right, and it's gone. All of it, and yours." He stopped. "How do you do it? The chickens? How does a person start? I've got a wife and a baby coming, and we've got nothing standing, and I'll do anything. I'll do it your way, only I don't know how a person starts." Hattie leaned on the shovel and looked at him a long moment. This boy whose father had laughed at the rail for 4 years, standing in her yard with his hat against his chest, asking to learn the thing his county had mocked. "You don't start now," she said, not unkindly. "Now's too late. This year's done. You start in the spring before the hatch, with the birds out ahead of it. It's not the killing, it's the timing." She straightened. "Come up to the porch. There's a book I'll read you some of. My mother wrote it. You'll want a pencil." He came up to the porch. The men came after that the way they would, in their own time and not all at once. Marvin Tubb came on the 3rd day with a sack of seed wheat. He said he owed her from a borrowing she did not remember, which was his way of not saying the other thing. He stood at the gate with his hat turning slow circles between his fingers and looked a long time at the standing wheat, and finally said, "I sprayed that south fence of mine 4 times, missus, 4 times, and it's bare to the dirt." He swallowed. "You stood there on the sidewalk and asked me why a thing I do every year only gets worse. I didn't have nothing to say to you then. I've been thinking on it since." "Then it wasn't wasted," Hattie said. "Come spring, you put the birds out ahead of the hatch. I'll tell you how many and when. It's in a book." Earl Dietz came the same afternoon and stood at the gate and could not make himself come in, and finally just said, loud, that it was a fine stand of wheat, missus, a fine stand, and got back in his truck and sat there a minute with his hands on the wheel before he drove off. Lloyd Penner never came at all, and she did not miss him. Garland Shaw came on the 5th day. He came in the washed Ford with a clean Stetson on the seat beside him instead of his head, and he stopped in her yard and got out bareheaded, which she had never once seen, and he stood with the hat in his two hands the way the young men stood. "I poisoned your hens," he said. It cost him to say it. She could see that it cost him. "Verna told me she'd not stay in my house another night if I didn't come say it to your face, so I'm saying it. I poisoned your birds because I wanted your ground, and I thought breaking your flock would break you. And then I watched the only standing wheat in this county come off the place I tried to ruin." He looked at the field, and then his gaze crossed to the dead grass desert that was his own half-section. "I'm not asking to lease your ground any more, Hattie. I'm asking you to keep me from losing mine. Verna says you'll know how. She says Eliza told her years back you'd be the one left standing when the bad year came." Hattie looked at him a long moment, the man who had buried 31 of her birds in a south wind. "Verna kept the poison off my fence and walked home so you wouldn't see your own truck gone," she said. "You owe that woman more than you'll ever pay her. As for your ground, come back in March before the hatch and bring a pencil, and don't bring that hat. The hens don't care for a man who keeps his hat too clean." It was the nearest thing to a joke she had made in 4 years, and Garland Shaw, to his credit, did not flinch from it. He put the clean Stetson back on his head and went home to thank his wife. Dr. Albert Reinhold came on the 4th day, and he walked her field with his notebook and counted her standing acres against the swept county and said very little. He had his June figures with him, and he read them out to her at the fence, flat, the way a man reads a thing he can no longer argue with. On the poisoned ground, 31 young hoppers to the square yard in June. On hers, 2. He had counted again that morning. On every sprayed field from her fence to the county line, the August stubble was bare. On the square yard he marked off in her standing wheat, he had turned up not one live grasshopper and not one egg pod in the soil, because the birds had eaten the breeders out of the ground before they ever laid. He closed the notebook. 3 years I'll need to write it so they'll print it, Reinhold said. Replicated. Controls the whole apparatus, so no man at the college can wave it off as one lucky widow. He looked at her. But I already know what it'll say. It'll say the poison treats the year you're in, and the birds treat the year that's coming. It'll say you can't arsenic your way out of a hatch this size, and never could. He stopped at her gate and put his hat on and said that he would be using her name after all. Cooperator B was cowardice, he said. I'll write it the way it happened. They'll argue with it for 10 years, and then they'll do it. He paused. You knew. You knew in June it would come like this. How? My mother knew, Hattie said. She wrote it down. I only read it. She cut her wheat the next week, 320 acres of it standing alone in a ruined country, and it threshed out better than her mother's best year, because the hoppers had cleaned every competing thing out of the world around it and left her field the only green that summer for the gleaning. She filled the granary, and she filled 2 more she rented in Goodland, and there was a line of trucks on her section road in August. Men come to buy seed wheat off the only woman in the western counties who had any, and she sold it to them at a fair price and not a penny over, and she wrote every bushel down in that same cracked ledger, column by column, in ink that dried darker than Eliza's ever was. The last thing she did that fall, when the wheat was sold and the birds were back in their long coop, and the first cold had come down off Colorado, was carry the ledger out one more time to the south fence, where the hens had held. She stood there in the dusk with the dead grasshoppers long since gone back into the dirt and new wheat already greening in the ground, and she opened the book to the first page and read again the line her mother had written in 1890 or thereabouts, in a hand 19 years in the grave. Hens to the wheat by the second week of June. Move them with the heat. Let nothing crawl that the birds can reach. She had not invented anything. That was the part the men never understood even after. She had not been clever, and she had not been lucky, and she had not, whatever they said in town now, been brave. She had only remembered out loud and on time a thing a hungry woman had learned on this same ground 60 years before and written down so it would not be lost. The method was never new. It was only true. And the year the grasshoppers ate the world, the truth of it had stood 320 acres tall in a country swept down to the dirt, because a dead woman had told her daughter when to move the flock, and the daughter had listened. Hattie Voss closed the ledger against the wind with her broad thumb and walked back up to the house in the last light, and the hens settled in the coop behind her for the night. If you knew a woman like this, a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor down some section road who held a place together with a knowledge nobody else would credit until the year it saved them, leave a comment and tell us what it was. Subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America, and we are working through them one harvest at a time.